5 years later, Thomas would realize that the night he chose silence had defined his entire career. He wasn't a politician. He wasn't a journalist. He wasn't meant to decide anything. He was a royal guard, standing in a restricted corridor, doing exactly what he had been trained to do: observe, protect, and remain invisible. But that night, behind a locked door that should have been dark, he heard something he was never meant to hear. And in the seconds that followed, Thomas made a choice. Not between right and wrong, but between speaking and carrying the weight of silence for the rest of his life. The stone walls of Windsor Castle held centuries of secrets. Some were written in history books. Others lived only in the memories of those who walked its corridors after dark. Sergeant Thomas Harding had walked those corridors for 9 years. Tonight would be different. The clock in the East Wing struck 11:30. Thomas stood at his post near the Chancellor's gallery, back straight, eyes forward, breathing measured. Night shifts were quiet. Tourists were gone. The royal family slept in their private residences. Only security personnel moved through the shadows, their footsteps echoing against polished marble. Thomas liked the night shift, the silence, the stillness, the absence of performance. During the day, royal guards were symbols, living statues. Tourists posed beside them, tested their discipline, tried to make them smile or flinch. Children asked questions their parents shushed. Cameras flashed constantly. But at night, the mask came off. At night, they were just soldiers doing a job. Thomas checked his watch. 11:45. In 15 minutes, he'd complete his patrol of the East Wing and hand off to Corporal Davies at the North checkpoint. Routine. Predictable. Safe. He began his walk. The East Wing stretched before him, a corridor of portraits and locked doors. Each painting watched him pass. Dead royals, dead nobles, dead politicians. All immortalized in oil and gold frames. All silent witnesses to whatever happened in these halls. Thomas had memorized every face during his first year. Now he barely noticed them. His boots made soft sounds against the carpet runner. The overhead lights were dimmed at night, creating pools of shadow between each fixture. Standard protocol. Enough light to navigate, not enough to disturb anyone sleeping nearby. He passed the first checkpoint. Empty. Davies wouldn't arrive for another 10 minutes. He continued. The corridor bent slightly to the left, following the castle's original medieval structure. Modern additions had tried to straighten things, but you couldn't fight 800 years of architecture. The castle had its own logic, its own geometry. Thomas turned the corner and stopped. Light. Not overhead light. Not the dim security fixtures that lined the corridor. This was warmer, brighter, coming from beneath a door that should have been dark. The Chancellor's private study. Thomas felt his pulse quicken slightly. He maintained his position, 30 feet from the door, processing what he was seeing. The Chancellor's study was restricted. Not forbidden exactly, but access was tightly controlled. The Chancellor used it for sensitive meetings, document review, private correspondence. The door was always locked outside of official hours. Always. Thomas moved closer, his training overriding his instinct to investigate immediately. Observe first, assess, then act. He stopped 10 feet from the door. The light beneath it was steady, not flickering. Someone inside. Then, not a forgotten lamp or electrical fault. He could hear voices. 2 voices. One he recognized immediately. The Chancellor's voice. Distinctive, clipped vowels, public school accent. A voice that had addressed Parliament, negotiated treaties, spoken at state funerals. The other voice was unfamiliar. Male. Younger.
Urgent.
Thomas stood perfectly still. Protocol was clear. If he heard anything suspicious in a restricted area, he should radio for backup immediately. Security would respond within 90 seconds. The occupants would be identified, questioned, documented. Standard procedure. But something stopped him. The tone of the conversation wasn't threatening. No raised voices. No sounds of struggle or distress. Just 2 men talking in a room that one of them had legitimate access to. Maybe the Chancellor was working late. Maybe he'd brought a junior aide for a confidential briefing. Maybe this was completely authorized and Thomas was overreacting. He took one step closer. The voices became clearer. Complete discretion, the chancellor was saying. No one can know where this came from. I understand, the younger voice replied. But you're certain about the timeline? Absolutely certain. The vote happens Thursday. If this information reaches the right people before then. Thomas felt ice in his stomach. This wasn't a briefing. This was something else. He should move. He should radio for backup. He should follow protocol. But his feet wouldn't move. The Prime Minister doesn't suspect? The younger voice asked. The Prime Minister, the Chancellor said with audible disdain, is too busy managing his image to notice what's happening in his own cabinet. Silence. Then, how do you want me to handle the journalist? Thomas stopped breathing. Journalist. The Chancellor was meeting with a journalist in a restricted royal residence at midnight, discussing leaked information that would affect a parliamentary vote. This wasn't a briefing. This was a breach. Thomas's training screamed at him. Radio it in. Document everything. Let the investigation team sort it out. But another part of his mind was already calculating consequences. If he reported this, the investigation would be immediate and thorough. The Chancellor would be questioned. His communications would be examined. His career would likely end, regardless of whether he'd technically broken any laws. The journalist would be identified and possibly arrested, depending on what information had been shared. The story would leak. It always did. Palace secrets never stayed secret, and Thomas would be at the center of it. The guard who brought down the Chancellor. His name would be in every newspaper, his face on every news channel, his decision analyzed, debated, praised, or condemned depending on political alignment. His career would effectively end. Not officially, but he'd never be trusted with sensitive assignments again. He'd be the guard who couldn't keep his mouth shut, who couldn't look the other way when looking the other way was the smarter choice. And for what? To stop a leak that would happen anyway? To protect a prime minister he'd never met? To preserve the integrity of a system that leaked like a sieve regardless of how many people like Thomas tried to plug the holes? He stood frozen, hand hovering over his radio. The voices continued inside the room. I'll need the documents by Tuesday, the younger voice said. You'll have them Monday night. Same location as last time. And payment. Already arranged. The account you specified. Payment. This wasn't just a leak. This was a transaction. Thomas felt something twist in his chest. Not shock. Something worse. Recognition. He'd always known this happened. Everyone did. Politicians leaked. Journalists paid sources. Information flowed between official channels and unofficial ones constantly. The machinery of power ran on secrets shared and secrets kept. But knowing it intellectually was different from standing 10 feet away from it happening in real time. He could end this. Right now. One radio call. His hand moved to his radio, then stopped. What would happen to the information if he stopped this meeting? The Chancellor would find another way to leak it. The journalist would find another source. The vote would happen Thursday regardless. The only difference would be that Thomas would have destroyed his career for nothing. And if the information was genuinely important, if the Chancellor was leaking something the public deserved to know, something that would expose corruption or prevent a terrible policy decision, then Thomas would have helped cover it up. He didn't know what the information was. He didn't know if the leak was justified or criminal. He didn't know if he was witnessing a betrayal or a necessary act of conscience. He only knew he was standing in a corridor at midnight, listening to something he was never meant to hear. The voices inside fell silent. Thomas heard movement, footsteps approaching the door. He had 3 seconds to decide. Report it and face the consequences, or walk away and carry it forever. Thomas made his choice. He turned and walked back the way he'd come. Quickly, quietly. His boots made no sound on the carpet. He turned the corner and pressed himself into an alcove between 2 portraits. The door to the Chancellor's study opened. Light spilled into the corridor. 2 silhouettes appeared. the Chancellor, recognizable even in shadow, and a younger man carrying a briefcase. They spoke briefly. Thomas couldn't hear the words from this distance. Then the younger man walked toward the north exit. The Chancellor watched him go, then retreated into his study and closed the door. The corridor returned to darkness. Thomas waited 5 full minutes before moving. His heart was pounding. His hands were shaking slightly. Adrenaline flooded his system even though nothing violent had happened. But something had happened. He'd witnessed something he wasn't supposed to see, and he'd chosen to walk away. He completed his patrol. He handed off to Corporal Davies at the north checkpoint exactly on schedule. Davies noticed nothing unusual. Thomas's face betrayed nothing. "Quiet night?" Davies asked. "Yes," Thomas said. "Quiet." He filed his patrol report at 0:30. Standard format. No incidents. No anomalies. All checkpoints clear. The lie appeared in black text on white paper, official and permanent. Thomas went home at 1:15. He lived in a small flat in Windsor, 10 minutes from the castle. He'd lived there alone since his divorce 3 years ago. He sat in his kitchen without turning on the lights. The silence was different now, heavier. He'd made his choice. He'd walked away. He'd protected himself and possibly the Chancellor and possibly the journalist and possibly the integrity of information that might be important. Or he'd become complicit in something corrupt. He didn't know which, and that was the worst part. Not knowing if he'd done the right thing or just the safest thing. The next day, Thomas reported for duty at 1400 hours. Standard afternoon shift. Back straight. Eyes forward. Face expressionless. Nothing had changed. Everything had changed. He stood at his post near the state apartments. Tourists flowed past. Cameras flashed. Children asked questions. "Do you ever move? Are you a real person? Does it hurt to stand so still?" Thomas stared at the middle distance and said nothing. That was his job. Be the symbol. Be the statue. Be the guard who never breaks. But inside, his mind worked constantly. He'd checked the news that morning. Nothing about a leak. Nothing about the Chancellor. The vote was scheduled for Thursday, as the conversation had indicated. Would the leak happen? Would it affect the vote? He didn't know. At 16:30, the Chancellor walked through the state apartments with a diplomatic delegation. Thomas stood at attention as they passed. The Chancellor glanced at him. Just a brief look. No recognition. No concern. Why would there be? The Chancellor had no idea Thomas had been outside his study last night. No idea he'd been overheard. As far as the Chancellor knew, his secret was safe. And Thomas had made it safe by choosing silence. The delegation moved on. Thomas remained at his post. His shift ended at 2200 hours. He filed his report. No incidents. No anomalies. He went home and sat in his kitchen again. This became his routine. Days passed. Thursday arrived. The parliamentary vote happened. Thomas checked the news obsessively. The vote passed, but barely. Several members of the ruling party had voted against their own government. The political analysts were shocked. How had the opposition known exactly which arguments to make? Which members to target? Someone had given them inside information. Someone had leaked. Thomas felt sick. He'd let it happen. He'd heard it being arranged and he'd walked away. But the analysts were also saying the vote's outcome was probably for the best. The policy in question had been deeply flawed. Experts agreed it would have caused more harm than good. So maybe the leak had been justified. Maybe the Chancellor had been right to share that information. Maybe Thomas had done the right thing by staying silent. He didn't know. He'd never know. Weeks passed. Thomas continued his duties. His performance was flawless. His reports were perfect. His record remained spotless. No one suspected anything. Why would they? Nothing had happened, officially. But at night, alone in his flat, Thomas replayed that corridor encounter endlessly. What if he'd reported it? What if he'd done his job exactly as trained? Would the outcome have been different? Would it have been better? He'd never know that either. One evening, 6 weeks after the incident, Thomas was assigned to night patrol again. Same route, same corridors, same silence. He approached the chancellor's study. The door was dark, no light, no voices. He stood outside it for a full minute, staring at the wooden panels. This was where it had happened, where he'd heard something he wasn't supposed to hear, where he'd made a choice that still haunted him. He continued his patrol. At the north checkpoint, Corporal Davies was waiting. "Quiet night?" Davies asked. "Yes," Thomas said. "Quiet." The same exchange as always. But Thomas heard the lie in his own voice now. Months passed. The political scandal had faded from the news. New crises emerged. New controversies. The world moved on. But Thomas didn't. He began to notice things he'd never noticed before. Doors that shouldn't be open. Conversations that stopped when he approached. Documents left carelessly on desks in rooms he was meant to patrol but not observe. The castle was full of secrets, and he was walking past all of them every single day, seeing nothing officially. How many other guards had made the same choice he'd made? How many had stood outside doors, hearing things they shouldn't hear, and chosen silence? Was he protecting the institution by staying silent? Or was he enabling its worst impulses? 1 year after the incident, Thomas was offered a promotion. Senior sergeant. More responsibility. More access. More trust. He accepted. He shouldn't have been surprised. His record was perfect. His loyalty was unquestioned. Because loyalty was measured by silence. The ceremony was brief. His commanding officer shook his hand. "You're one of the good ones, Harding," the officer said. "Reliable. Discreet. Exactly what this position requires." Discreet. The word stayed with Thomas. That evening, he stood in front of his bathroom mirror. The same face looked back at him. Same eyes. Same expression. But something inside had changed. He'd always believed he was protecting something important. The monarchy. The institution. The tradition. But what if he was just protecting secrets that deserved to be exposed? What if discretion was just another word for complicity? He didn't know. And after a year of thinking about it every single day, he still didn't know if he'd made the right choice. Maybe that was the point. Maybe there were no right choices in situations like that. Just choices. And consequences. And the burden of carrying them forever. 2 years after the corridor incident, Thomas was assigned to accompany Princess and on a visit to a military hospital. Standard duty. Close protection in civilian clothes. During a break between ward visits, the princess turned to him. "Sergeant Harding, you've been with us quite some time." 9 years, ma'am. "And in all that time, have you ever been asked to compromise your principles?" The question caught him completely off guard. He hesitated. The princess smiled slightly. "That hesitation is answer enough." She looked out the window at the hospital grounds. "This institution runs on discretion," she said quietly. "On loyalty. On people who know when to speak and when to stay silent." She turned back to him. "But discretion has a cost, doesn't it? Especially when you're not certain if your silence is protecting something worth protecting." Thomas said nothing. "I ask because I've made those choices too," she continued. "We all have. Everyone who serves this family, in any capacity, eventually faces a moment where they must decide. Report what they've seen or look away." She paused. "There's no right answer, Sergeant. Only consequences either way." Thomas felt something loosen in his chest. Relief, maybe, or recognition. "How do you live with it, ma'am?" he asked quietly. "By remembering that you did what you thought was right in that moment. Not what was easy, not what was safe, what felt right." She smiled again. "And by accepting that you'll never know if you made the correct choice. That uncertainty is the price of discretion." The conversation ended there. They returned to the ward visits. Nothing more was said, but something had shifted. Thomas realized he'd been waiting for someone to tell him he'd done the right thing, or the wrong thing, anything to resolve the uncertainty. But there would be no resolution. No absolution. No final judgment. Just the choice he'd made, and the weight of carrying it. 5 years after the corridor incident, Thomas retired from the Royal Guard. His ceremony was well attended. His service record was exemplary. He received commendations, medals, a letter of appreciation from the royal household. No one mentioned the things he'd seen and chosen not to report, because officially he'd seen nothing. He moved to Cornwall, a small cottage near the coast, away from London, away from the castle, away from corridors and secrets and choices that haunted you. But distance didn't erase memory. He thought about that night often. The light under the door, the voices, the moment he'd decided to walk away. Had the information that was leaked that night been important? Had it prevented something terrible? Or had it just been politics as usual, one faction undermining another? He'd never know. The Chancellor had retired 2 years ago. The journalist, if Thomas had identified him correctly from later research, was still working, still publishing stories, still receiving information from sources who remained anonymous. The system continued. The machinery of power kept running. Secrets were leaked and secrets were kept, and people like Thomas stood guard over it all, seeing everything and nothing simultaneously. On quiet mornings, he walked along the cliff paths. The sea stretched out endlessly. No walls, no corridors, no doors hiding conversations he wasn't meant to hear. But the memory walked with him. Sometimes he imagined what would have happened if he'd made the other choice, if he'd radioed for backup that night, if he'd reported what he'd heard. The investigation, the scandal, the questions. Would it have mattered? Would anything have actually changed? Or would the system have simply adjusted, found another way, continued as it always had? He didn't know. After 5 years of retirement, he still didn't know. And he realized, finally, that he would carry this uncertainty for the rest of his life. Not as punishment, not as guilt, just as reality. The weight of seeing something you were never meant to see. The burden of choosing silence when you didn't know if silence was right. The cost of discretion in a world where discretion protected both necessary secrets and dangerous ones, and you couldn't always tell which was which. Thomas stood on the cliff path, looking out at the sea. The wind was cold. The sky was gray. He'd spent 9 years as a royal guard, standing still, seeing everything, saying nothing. And in one corridor, on one night, he'd made a choice that defined him more than all those years of faithful service. Not because he'd been heroic, not because he'd been cowardly, but because he'd been human, uncertain, conflicted, trying to do what seemed right with incomplete information and impossible consequences either way. That was the real story behind the uniform, not the pageantry, not the tradition, but the moments of choice that no one ever saw. The secrets kept, the burdens carried, the uncertainty embraced. Thomas turned and walked back toward his cottage. Behind him, the sea continued its endless motion, waves breaking, tides turning, everything in constant flux except the fundamental truth. Some choices haunt you not because you made them wrong, but because you'll never know if you made them right. And you carry them anyway, because that's what it means to serve. Not with certainty, not with clarity, but with the weight of knowing that sometimes seeing something means choosing whether anyone else should see it too, and living with that choice forever.